When President Donald Trump first proposed his plan to end the war in Gaza, the White House shared a map of the strip with different colored lines along the inside of its borders. The outermost parameter marks a buffer zone where the Israeli military is expected to retreat eventually in some distant future with no defined timeline. A little further in is a red line indicating the boundaries for a second withdrawal phase. The next border in is a yellow line. That's where the army is now, or at least supposed to be. Its coordinates are vague. Depending on which version of the map you see, that line will look a little different. In all cases, it eats up more than half of Gaza's territory. But on the ground, there is no bright colored line. It's invisible, and Palestinians are getting killed for allegedly crossing it or simply approaching it. In a recent incident, Israel's military said it fired at a, quote, suspicious vehicle that went beyond the line. A family of 11, including children, were killed. The line is supposed to be a temporary measure, but it's causing confusion and fear for Gazans who say the war never really stopped. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your guest host, Ban Barkawi. In this episode, we look at what's happening beyond the yellow line and question why it has become so deadly. More recently, Israel's military has been installing big yellow cement blocks to mark the boundaries of the line. One block every several hundred meters, so people can at least know where not to go. But there are still questions about their positions and how long they'll remain. I speak about this to Palestinian political analyst Khalil Sayegh. Have you been able to speak to anybody in Gaza? What have they been telling you about living on the confines of this invisible yellow line?
To start with, majority of the people are forced to be beyond the yellow line, meaning that even if you lived within what's called the yellow line today, you're not allowed to go back to your home. Your home most likely has been demolished because the Israelis continue to demolish houses there. But even if your house is not demolished yet, you're not allowed to go beyond what's so known as the yellow line. For the first week of the ceasefire, the yellow line seemed invisible in the sense that there was no signs or whatsoever of what this yellow line looked like. It looked mysterious. And a lot of people were killed just by attempting to cross this invisible line that they didn't know that it existed. And the Israelis would just shoot at them or kill them. In the last 2 weeks, what we've seen is the Israelis start installing physical concretes with a yellow painting on them to show people more that this is where they're not supposed to go beyond. And since then, we've seen that people are more careful to not go to these areas, and thus the killing has been decreased to an extent. And that being said, we don't know enough information about what happens beyond the yellow line. The only thing we know is that the Israeli military is there and they're demolishing houses. And we know that there are Israeli-backed militias that are operating beyond this yellow line as well. And most likely, there seems to be evidence too that some of the families that are part of these, their males are part of these militias, are also beyond the yellow line in certain areas, especially in Rafah.
This installation of these physical yellow roadblocks or signs, what have you, you're saying that there's been a noticeable decrease in killing since these have been installed. So this is being seen as a positive development. Is it also being seen as sort of a physical demarcation, a physical imprint that could be there indefinitely?
It's both. On the one hand, it's good that people know where the yellow line is because we don't want to see more and more people getting killed because the Israelis weren't clear at all. And Hamas wasn't also clear into where this line is because they don't want to be seen as weak and as defeated in Gaza. And they're sort of, accepting the enemy's conditions, etc. And therefore, you left the civilian population with no clarity on that. The killing continues. On the other hand, this also symbolizes that this yellow line wouldn't just be a matter of 1 day or 2 or few weeks. It would rather be longer than that. We've seen some remarks by Israeli officials like Israel Katz, the Minister of Defense, who basically say that this will be more of a permanent situation. Also, there have been other statements by U.S. officials that the reconstruction of Gaza will start beyond the yellow line in the areas that Hamas don't control anymore. So all these are concerning signs. So it's both positive and negative at the same time.
The other thing you mentioned was what's happening behind these yellow lines. What activity do we know of? Are there battles happening in this area? Is there any actual fighting?
There is no fighting between Israel and Hamas whatsoever. There was certain incidents where Hamas fighters have shot at Israeli-backed militias beyond the yellow line, but without getting in. Like there was incidents what happened in Shijaiya, incidents that happened in Rafah and others. Hamas tried to intimidate these gangs and try to, maintain monopoly over power even within these areas. But so far they have been unsuccessful because of the Israeli military protection for them. There has been the incidents where, a few days ago, I believe, there was two Israeli soldiers that were killed in the Rafah area, and it wasn't clear what happened. Hamas denied any responsibility. Israel claimed that it was Hamas who, installed explosions there, but it wasn't. There was no evidence. And then yesterday, a sniper shot an Israeli soldier, and Hamas again denies any responsibility, and it's not very clear there. So we don't. I don't think that Hamas has any official policy to go into any sort of battle with Israel or even with its back gangs beyond the yellow line, because at this point Hamas is concerned with maintaining the ceasefire. So what's likely to be happening with these, some incidents that happen are probably members of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or even other factions that are not really obeying orders, and they're just, seeing an opportunity of Israeli soldiers in front of them, and they shot at them.
Is there any veracity to some of other reports that came out saying that these Israeli soldier deaths were a result of IEDs or home demolitions? Do we know anything about that, or are these just sort of rumors?
The last incident is most likely a result of IED or some form of that. Could be something installed by the IDF themselves or something that, the armed groups in Gaza have installed and they didn't take it away. The claim by the Israelis was very specific that there was a sniper attack that shot this person. And this, there is no way for us to verify whether that's true or not. If that's true, then as I said, most likely this is a rogue actor, because here's the thing. If Hamas was able to fight before the ceasefire and maintain certain power, it was because they have the hostages as well, and they have some sort of leverage to negotiate in the future. They're staying in power or whatever. Right now, they don't have any leverage. And to imagine that Hamas would just lose the win they had, which is basically that they survived that, would be foolish. So there is no reasonableness to the claim that Hamas is interested in violating the ceasefire whatsoever.
Over the course of 2 years of war, Israel has been accused of ethnic cleansing by forcibly displacing Palestinians in Gaza countless times. Throughout the ceasefire negotiations, which had all failed up until recently, there was an insistence by Israel to continue to maintain control over buffer zones and what have you. Are there fears that it could be using this line as a tool or an instrument to further occupy more territory in Gaza or to further consolidate its siege on the Strip?
The areas that Israel control are fully empty almost. They even cleanse the people, they kick them out, and they're demolishing the houses, etc. And there are many residents that are in Gaza City today and Khan Yunis and other areas that cannot go back to beyond the yellow line where they live. So yes, it's an issue. If this is temporary, if the yellow line is temporary, and you're not thinking of, reoccupying and the buffer zones and all of that, tightening the siege, why are you demolishing houses? And I'm not talking one house or two in a massive way, right? They're just wiping off entire cities. Rafah is completely wiped off. They're doing the same thing in the east of Gaza City, and they're doing the same thing up in northern the Gaza Strip in Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. So there is concerns there. If we want to follow the full plan of President Trump, it's supposed to be there is withdrawal, but even within the final withdrawal, there is still, I believe between 10 to 20% of the Gaza Strip will go to what's called the buffer zone. And that's another huge loss for the Palestinians in Gaza.
Coming to the plan itself, do we know if there has been any sort of discussion about how this will be monitored or enforced, or how these phases will gradually lead to one another? Because it seems as though Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians who live in Gaza have kind of been left to manage the terms of this plan on their own. Why are we not seeing some mechanism of enforceability?
That's one of the weaknesses of the agreement, that there wasn't a clear mechanism to enforce it. The other thing, that there was no clear mechanism to connect each of the stages to another stage. When the deal came, everyone was optimistic for the entire deal, but I don't think anyone thought of how it would be divided to phases, because it turns out both sides are more interested in playing the game of phases and waiting, etc. For Hamas, Again, they don't want to disarm. They don't want to go through this conversation of the day after, etc. So phase one and then phase two is good for them, with the hope that they will survive again and they prove to be the only power capable of filling the security gap. And on the other hand, for Israel, they want to maintain that they have some sort of leverage to re-wage the war if it's needed. We'll have to wait for phase one to be over, all the bodies to be handed, for us to see how we will, go to phase two. And I think what will happen is likely they will reconvene in Sharm el-Sheikh or Egypt or somewhere, Qatar maybe, and there will be another conversation over the withdrawal and over the stage two of it. But it's going to be very messy. Many of the actors that the US was counting on, like Egypt and Jordan, have become more and more skeptical of it. I mean, you've seen the statement by King Abdullah, where he's basically saying that shouldn't be expected to just, go into Gaza and disarm Hamas. This is not likely. No one is concerned also with like just surrounding Gaza and basically taking the role of the IDF and besieging Gaza. So all these obstacles and complexity will be coming up as phase one finishes.
If or when the next phase of the ceasefire comes into effect, Israeli troops are expected to withdraw even further out toward the borders of Gaza. But what is the military purpose of these occupied zones? And will these lines be temporary or will they remain indefinitely? I discussed this with Francesco Schiavi, Middle East analyst and non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, Switzerland. This yellow line is Israel saying it's intended to protect its own borders and its own population, but it is causing a lot of confusion on the ground in Gaza. Based on Trump's ceasefire plan, what exactly is this line supposed to delineate according to the ceasefire agreement?
The White House presented it as the boundary for phase one of the ceasefire, let's say a partial withdrawal meant to create what they call a stabilization zone. It effectively freezes the battlefield where Israeli forces stop their advance and marks the zone from which they assert a secure perimeter of control. According to the UN, the yellow line runs from the northern edge of Gaza all the way down to Rafah in the south, cutting across large populated areas. It's not a recognized border, nor an official ceasefire demarcation. This is very important to stress. It's a tactical boundary, let's say. It's a way to consolidate territorial control while diplomacy is still in motion. So its purpose on paper is to facilitate a gradual transition to a multinational or a Palestinian-led administration, let's say, but in practice, it legitimizes Israel's retention of buffer areas and signals also where initial control will persist. So the danger here lies in its ambiguity, I think, and it lacks a timeline for withdrawal. This is very important. So while Washington sells it as a confidence-building measure, the risk here is that what began as a temporary measure risks becoming a de facto frontier, so leaving Gaza's political future unresolved.
One of the things that reports have been saying is that there are demolitions, home demolitions that are happening behind this yellow line and perhaps other activity that we're not aware of. Is there anyone who's monitoring or any entity that's monitoring Israel's activity beyond this yellow line since the ceasefire? Anybody to check whether or not it's sticking to its terms of the agreement there?
The monitoring is very little, and in this it's deliberate. At present, there is no independent monitoring mechanism jointly managed by Israel and any other external actors to verify incidents behind the yellow line. The UN's Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs issues situation reports, but these rely, let's say, on secondary data because UN staff cannot access those zones directly. They confirmed, I quote, information gaps, particularly in central Gaza, where most of Israel's claim about attacks on its troops originate. Between October 15 and 22, the IDF reported at least 2 soldiers killed in Gaza, yet no public or third-party verification followed. So here we can see how the absence of a joint investigation body or even satellite-based transparency measures agreed by both parties means each side control its own narrative. Israel justified its ongoing operation as a necessary response to a mass activity, while Gaza authorities highlight civilian casualties to contest that claim. So this information vacuum leaves the truth contested and undermines the credibility of any future phase 2 implementation, in my opinion.
Is there any justification in cases of conflict where one warring side can indefinitely control an area on another warring side's territory? And in this case, is there any justification, valid justification, for this demarcation?
In legal terms, no. Israeli forces assert the right to engage fighters attempting to infiltrate beyond the yellow line. But again, the yellow line is not an internationally recognized border. There is a lack of clear boundaries, which is an essential element to consider. And under international law, rules of engagement must distinguish between civilians and combatants. And the lack of independent oversight, the one that we mentioned before, makes the practical threshold for trespassing murky. In practice, several incidents these months show a different pattern. Press, UN reports document civilians shot near aid corridors or farmland sent to a line which is without clear physical markers. For instance, if I remember well, on October 17, 11 members of one family, including half of them children, were killed near farmland after staying past the demarcation. From a purely military perspective, Israel justified the yellow line as a buffer zone to prevent attacks on its troops and border communities. Military planners describe it as a temporary envelope. Roughly, it runs between 700 and 1,000 meters deep, allowing rapid incursions and denying Hamas freedom of movement near the frontier. Of course, in military doctrine, buffers like these have clear tactical value, but the problem lies in the scale and the intent. It stops being a tactical measure and starts looking like territorial re-engineering, in my opinion. So, yes, there is a military rationale, but yet its implementation reveals a strategic aim to create layered, controllable zones inside Gaza.
Israel has been installing these cement blocks in areas that are sort of near that yellow line. There have been reports that Israel may be expanding its control deeper than agreed upon and using these cement blocks as sort of trying to place them in areas that are a little bit deeper into Gaza. Is there any evidence of this?
The short answer is yes. Despite talk of withdrawal, Israel maintains a dense military footprint beyond the yellow line. So some satellite imagery and some OSINT sources map roughly 40, if not more, Israeli positions still active inside Gaza beyond the line, including forward observation posts, armored outposts, and temporary logistic hubs. These are not isolated elements. We should consider them as a network of, let's say, overlapping control designed to monitor movement and deter infiltration by Hamas. Many media outlets registered 80 ceasefire violations attributed to Israeli action since October 10, if I remember well, resulting in near 100 Palestinian killed and more than 200 wounded inside this demarcated area. So, in short, we can say that the line is porous. Israel keeps calling it a flexible perimeter, allowing limited operation for tactical reasons. But the result is a blurred reality where the IDF claims to have repositioned. It seems to me that they have rebunched the operations behind the line, maintaining reach into Gaza's interior.
You mentioned that there is no clear timeline. What is likely to happen if this line stays in place without a deadline to withdraw its boundaries?
If the yellow line remains open-ended, I think it risks from a tactical buffer zone into a de facto border, as I mentioned, much like Israel's security fence in the West Bank after the Second Intifada. If the line becomes entrenched as the effective limit of Palestinian jurisdiction without a clear timeline for full withdrawal or a phased handover, it could, let's say, ossify into what some analysts recently described as a, let's say, a slow motion annexation, where a temporary tactical boundary becomes a political one through inertia. Geographically, Gaza risks being partitioned into at least three functional zones, let's say an outer belt controlled by Israel, a narrow humanitarian corridor under international oversight, and a residual enclave under, let's say, nominal at least Palestinian or international administration. Politically, such a frozen map would entrench no war, no peace situation, pulling the conflict away from a final settlement towards long-term limbo. Also, it could provoke regional backlash, for example, for Gulf and Arab states like Egypt and Jordan that backed the Trump plan. This may become a liability. They risk finding themselves committed to a framework that looks more like prolonged occupation rather than stabilization. And they could also face domestic pressure to distance themselves from what, again, looks more like an endless occupation.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. For more reporting on Gaza after the ceasefire, visit thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by me, Ban Barkawi. It was audio engineered by Arthur Edison, and Du'a Farid is our editor. Thanks for listening.